Welcome back to the channel. Thank you for watching and thank you for subscribing. So I've had lots of questions about what happens in a confidential conference between lawyer and their client, and in the context of recent televised trials, but also in the context of academic study. So I thought I would explain to you in this video what happens in a private conference and what's the objective of a conference, how it's conducted, what we are supposed to be doing, and importantly, what we are not doing. So I thought I would probably take a criminal case as an example to run through if someone is accused of a crime and then we are instructed to have a conference with that client and then go to represent them in court. What do we do and what do we say in conference? Because hopefully most of you will never have this experience, so you won't know what happens in a conference between client and lawyer when they're accused of a crime. So let's get started. So of course, in your introduction, you will explain why you are there in the first place, because certainly in England and Wales, the client has probably had a solicitor already, and then you as the barrister come in for the conference before going into court. Your client might be wondering why they're meeting somebody new. Now in England and Wales, and I'm sure there might be some equivalent internationally, there is often a divide between someone who's preparing a case and someone who is representing the case in court. In England and Wales, we have the solicitor to prepare the case typically, and the barrister, again, typically going to represent the client in court. So the introduction stage is just that, explaining who you are and why you're there. And why you're there is as follows. The conference is broadly broken into two sections. First is our questioning section. This forms the substantive portion of the conference. Why? Because we need to know all of the details in as much detail as possible so that we can best represent the client in court. Because if we don't know the facts of the case, then we cannot do that. We need to understand what the client says about the case against him, and we need to know what we can say on our client's behalf that can best help them in any kind of defense. So let's dispel a few myths first of all. First of all, the lawyer is not there just to, as the saying goes, get your client off the charge. Now, of course, if there is a valid defense there, it is your job to find that defense. And if there is a valid defense, then you can advise them on pleading not guilty if that's the case. If, on the other hand, your client does tell you that they are guilty of the offense, or that the facts that they tell you make out that your client is guilty of the offense, then you have a duty, first of all, to explore that that really is the case and they really are guilty and that they're not just mistaken as to the facts that they've given you. But if all that transpires that they are guilty, they've either told you or the facts make out the case that they are guilty, then you have a duty to advise them to plead guilty. But only if that's really the case. Because if they are guilty and they plead guilty, they get a reduction in any sentence that they would get. And this amount of reduction reduces the closer you get to trial. So this would start out at the first opportunity with a third off the sentence, going down to a quarter and all the way down to a tenth, and then possibly nothing when you get to trial if they've not pleaded guilty but they are found guilty, as against pleading guilty to something that they really did do. Now, the second myth to dispel is that if the evidence is absolutely overwhelming against your client, but they have a valid defense, or part of their case negates the case against them, i.e. they tell you that they didn't do it, or they tell you something that would mean they didn't do it, or when they tell you something that even contradicts part of the case against them. So let's say with theft, there is a dishonesty element. If your client says, well, it wasn't dishonest, he told me that I could use it, then therefore it's not dishonest. So if part of what they tell you counters one of the elements of the offense, then by reasoning of law, they are not guilty of that crime. Even if the evidence is overwhelming against them, you cannot advise them to plead guilty because part of what they've told you will negate part of the offense. Therefore, as a matter of law, they are not guilty of that offense because the prosecution must make out every element of the offense. And for theft, as the example, there are 5 elements of this offence, which is very often a high burden for the prosecution to prove. It must be the dishonest appropriation of property belonging to another with the intention to permanently deprive them of it. So you can break that down into each of the elements and question your client about these things. So, for example, you cannot steal property that is your own. And if you took something honestly, as against dishonestly, then it cannot be theft. So if someone said you could borrow something and then you took it, but then they had an argument with you, they got upset and they reported you for theft, however, you honestly took it at the time because you were friends at the time, then you didn't steal it because you took it honestly. Also, if there is a dispute as to the ownership of the property, because you cannot steal something that belongs to you. So if you've taken something that you say belongs to you, they say it belongs to them, and there's an argument as to who it belongs to, not only is there an argument over the dishonesty element of the offence, but there is also an argument over whose property it is, because it must be property belonging to another for one of the elements of theft. And again, if you borrowed something and intended to return it, even if it's without permission, but if you intended to return it as against permanently deprive them of it, then it may not amount to theft either. This is why we had a specific offence brought in called taking without consent for vehicles. So if someone takes your vehicle without consent but intends to dump it somewhere or let you have it back, whilst it might not amount to theft, that would amount to taking without consent, or twacking as the colloquial term is used. So this really is the purpose of the questioning stage of the conference. You have to put the case that is against your client to your client to question about their account, why they were there, why they were doing something, what really happened, what they say about what happened. And you must also put, if there is a witness that says they were there, your client says they were not there, you have to put that account to the client. So, for example, in family cases where there are allegations, you have to put each allegation to your client, sometimes robustly if they deny it. Because let's say there's an allegation that they caused injuries and there are medical photographs of those injuries and a detailed account, they went to hospital and so on, then you must put that case to your client and say, well, the medical professional says that this was caused by, for example, grabbing the arm. Because when somebody grabs someone's arm quite fiercely, it leaves finger-sized marks on the arm, little dark marks around the arm that look like 3 or 4 or 5 brown marks in the shape and size of fingers on someone's arm. So that is usually fairly good evidence that someone's arm has been grabbed aggressively. So if the opposing party says your client did that, you need to put that account to your client and say, the medical professional says this was caused by someone grabbing an arm. How do you say this happened if it wasn't you? So your client can then say, well, he or she had an argument with, the guy next door or an old friend that came around or whatever the case might be. But either way, you need your client's account so that you know what questions to put in evidence, so that when you're representing the case in court, you know what the case is to defend your client. Now remember, if your client maintains a denial about this event, you do need details about what that denial is, but if they deny it, you cannot advise them to plead guilty to the offence, because if they are denying it, or if there is evidence against it, or they're putting forward a positive case against the charges, then again, as I said, you can't just advise them to plead guilty. That's not how it works. Once you've gone through all of the facts in great detail and you've got a detailed account from your client, and it must be very detailed, this is the bulk of the conference, then you can go into your advice section. So you can advise your client what the charge is, what they're being accused of, very simply where it's found in law, without educating your client. You're not teaching your client the law, they are not doing a law degree, and they are not there to receive academic prowess from you. They just want from you a simple explanation of you've been charged with assault, which means, and then a brief explanation of whatever that offence is that your client is accused of doing. Then you can give a realistic prospect of what sentence they might face, given the facts and the circumstances and the seriousness of the offence with which they've been charged, but keeping it to an appropriate and minimum. So, for example, some offences has a maximum of life in prison, but in this particular case, they're likely to get 3 or 4 weeks in prison. So you wouldn't start out by saying the maximum for this is life, but they're not going to get life in this case, and it wouldn't be sensible to tell them that. You could say, for example, the range for this offence would start with a high community order, which essentially means you go and work for free for a company. So you may be doing hours working, cleaning the floors of shops for free for a number of hours or something like that, up to a certain number of weeks in prison. Then, of course, as the barrister, you make a judgment, a sensible judgment as to what this defendant would get if they were convicted or indeed pleaded guilty to this offence. But then, of course, you feed back to the client the discussion you've had and whether what they've told you amounts to a defence in law. If so, then you tell them that you will in due course go on to advise them to plead not guilty. You then go through an assessment of the strength of the evidence against them. as against the strength of the evidence in their favor, in their defense. Now, an emphasis here which a lot of people fall foul on, especially when they are doing the bar course, and this is a common failure, is don't confuse the strength of the evidence with whether or not you advise somebody to plead guilty. Very overwhelming strong evidence does not equal they should plead guilty. Because, as I said, it's fundamental and important. If they've told you something that either amounts to a defense or negates part of the case against them, you cannot advise them to plead guilty. But the reverse is true. If everything they've told you amounts to an admission that they have done it and there is no legal valid defense, then you must advise them to plead guilty. But then and only then. However, it is still a matter for the client to choose whether they plead guilty or not. Your advice is because if they plead guilty and you advise to plead guilty, they get a reduction in their sentence. But it's still a matter for them. They make the ultimate choice. And as a lawyer, you cannot sit on the fence. You cannot say, well, you could plead guilty, you could plead not guilty. You are there to advise, you must advise, and if you don't advise, you're not doing your job. And one of the final stages is you must take instructions on plea, because as the barrister, you need to know what your client is going to plead when you get into court. Again, this is important because it affects what sentence they might get. And of course, you need to know. So you must take instructions on the plea, guilty or not guilty. Because as I said, it is always the client's choice. It's not your choice as the lawyer whether they plead guilty or not. It is not your choice, although some people seem to think so, to plea bargain and say, well, if my client pleads guilty to this, then what can you do, or what can you reduce the thing to? The prosecution may offer your client an alternative, and you put that alternative to your client, and your client has a choice as to whether they decide to plead guilty or not guilty to the lesser charge. But at the same time, you go through the same process, because if what your client's told you negates or denies the allegations, then your advice must be that they plead not guilty. Irrespective of whether there is a lower charge offered with a lower sentence offered, your advice must remain true, professional, and honest. And finally, the nature of the conference is entirely confidential. If your client tells you something that absolutely renders you unable to assist them, such as, yes, it was me, I did do it, then you must tell your client that it's going to severely restrict what you can do in court, because the rules do not allow us to mislead the court. So if your client admits to doing something and admits to being on the scene, you cannot put forward to the court that they were not there and that a witness was mistaken for seeing them there if you know that they were there. You cannot do that. However, the nature of the conference is confidential. So you must tell your client that you can only disclose those facts to the court with their permission. But if they don't allow you to do so, it may severely harm how you can represent them when you get to court. But as such, this ultimately means the nature of the questions you can put to your client can be open, can be leading, can be pressing. Ideally open questions, because that's the best way of getting information from your client. But if you want to put a leading question to get straight to the point, usually on matters that are not likely to be disputed by your client, it will speed things up a little bit. But the most important thing is that you must put the case against your client to your client. This witness says X. How can you explain that? What do you have to say about that? The prosecution witness says this. Why do you think they would say that? What do you have to say about that? So I hope that's been enlightening. I'm sure there are 1,000 questions that will arise from this. If you find it interesting, please do like the video and subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Leave any of your follow-up questions in the box below. Has anything surprised you? Is there anything that remains unclear? Is there anything you'd like me to talk more about? Leave those questions and comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching.